Welcome to another episode of the Art Astro podcast. Today we have with us researcher Tayra Lanuza Navarro. Welcome. It's been a long time since we have been discussing for you to be here at our podcast. Tayra is a researcher on the history of astrology, especially in the Spanish world, Spanish-speaking world. And she's currently at the Foscari University in Venice in the ERC project headed by Pietro Omodeo on the early modern period. So once again, welcome, Tayra.
Thank you very much, Luis. Nice to be here.
So I would start to ask you to speak a little bit about your trajectory in academia and how you end up researching the history of astrology, because you have been one of the few researchers who has really gone into depth into the history of astrology in Spain and the Spanish Empire, really, in the pre-modern Spanish Empire. Yeah.
Okay, so the question is how it all started, and I must say it was all fault of Victor Navarro, my PhD supervisor. I finished my degree in history with a specialization in early modern history, and I missed science in my contents in my life. So luckily, my university is one of the few with a history of science department, like yours.
Yeah,
we're lucky.
We're lucky.
That.
Yeah, true.
And so I went there and to speak with professors about doing my PhD there and my postgraduate training, etc. And I have always loved astronomy. So I wanted to do something on astronomy, and I wanted to focus on the early modern period, which was my specialty. So Victor Navarro was the specialist in early modern astronomy at this university. And he was the one. I wanted to do something on the Republic of Letters, because communication of science has always been one of the themes that fascinates me, and how the scientific community creates knowledge through that communication. And that was my very rough initial idea. And he told me there is something about the history of astronomy in Spain that no one has studied. There's mostly nothing about it. There are a few references here and there, a few mentions of documents, but which is the role of astrology in astronomy, but in general in scientific activity. And at first I was surprised, but of course it's the 16th and 17th century where astrology had such a relevant role in the scientific practices and intellectual context that looking at the sources, it turned out to be so fascinating, and everything was so new, not studied by anyone, that I got deep in there and never got out.
Yeah, you got the clean field to explore.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, the same happened with me and Elena here in Portugal, because there are a few studies, but nothing that really goes into the history of astrology. So we were.
I know. Yeah.
We were the first ones to really go into that.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you have done that work and will go on doing it, because Portugal is of course part of the
especially in this period that we're talking about, it's all part of the same. It's the same empire, the same Spanish Empire, and the only Portuguese book on astrology which I consider a manual in astrology, is published in Spanish language. So it's published in Lisbon by a Portuguese author, probably of Spanish origin, but he still always tells us that he's Portuguese, born in Lisbon. But it's in Spanish, and he specifically says he's writing in Spanish so that he has a wider audience for his book.
Oh, okay. That makes sense, of course. Yeah, when I was doing the thesis, I wanted to read all sources published by Spanish astrologers or in Spain, and doing that, it had to include Portuguese publications between 1580 and 1640, because it was part of the, not of Spain, but of the territories belonging to the crown of Spain. And I had to, it made sense to include Portuguese texts of that period.
Yeah, exactly. As it would for the Portuguese side, we have to look at what's happening in Spain,
of course,
because I'm sure they're exchanging a lot of information at that time. That's something to really try to understand at some point. What kind of exchange is there? If
that
any.
Would be great, and people going and coming from the court, being in this court and that court, and in the academic world as well.
There's still a lot to do, I think.
Which is good, but
So can you tell us a little bit about your the results of your thesis? So you went into a completely unexplored field, and what was your first impressions? What did you find out that surprised you or that you weren't expecting?
It's what surprised me back then, which was like 15 years ago, is of course not that new. Now that we have the last 15 years of historiography of astrology, all the new studies of the last decades or 15 years, which have changed the field a lot. But I first was surprised at the implication of astrology in so many branches of knowledge, that you couldn't just focus on astronomical ideas and the relationship with astrology or how it was part of it, etc. You had to look at natural philosophers and their different perspectives, cosmographers, and how also their activity was involved, at physicians, because the medical activity included astrological knowledge, and it was so relevant. And then the institutions, it was there at the universities being taught, it was at the Imperial College, at the Jesuit order, and I liked that bit because I thought that we, as researchers in the field, have to emphasize that it is related to nearly every branch of knowledge in the period. And the map of knowledge, as historians of science we had been working before with, was not accurate because it was not including the extremely relevant role of astrology in it. So that was the main result, I would say, besides getting to know all the Spanish sources which have never been explored. Popular and scholar sources on astrology. True.
That's something, what you said is very important. 15 years ago when you did the thesis, we already had some historiography, but not enough. And nowadays it's true that people are starting to realize, outside the field has starting to realize the importance that astrology has in the
there's much more.
And how it describes the universe around us, and it's part of the cosmology, so you cannot really avoid it, and it's there everywhere. The astrological thinking is there.
Exactly. I remember reading one of the first books I read was Patrick Carey's Astrology, Science and Society, And one of his sentences, I don't know if it was the end sentence of one of the chapters or something, he said, "I'm not trying to say that astrology was everywhere, but it was very important." And I think with in the last 20 years after his book, or 30, we have realized that it's much more everywhere than we wanted to admit 30 years ago.
Yeah, I had the same sense. I have the same perception. Yes, it's everywhere in the religious discourse. It's in the scientific discourse. It's in the culture, from the high court culture to the lowest agricultural, people of the field culture. It's there in one way or another. That way of thinking, it's there. It's very pervasive.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's strange that it has, but it's not strange that it has been ignored. We all know why.
Yeah.
Because it's one of the so-called wretched subjects. So it has been ignored for historiography for a long time. But it's quite important to understand from cultural, scientific perspective, religious, etc. Yeah, here too. And would you say, did you find? Well, this is a difficult question to answer, perhaps, but did you find anything in the Spanish practice of astrology that you would think it's a little different from elsewhere? I'm asking you this, and I'm going to give you the example that I found how it in Portugal. Okay. In Portugal, it seems that it was a bit. Well, it was not underground, but you don't see a lot of material coming up. So we really still don't know a lot about who was practicing and who was doing it. And it has been ignored for so long that we really don't have a built-up historiography on it. I hope to help with that. But I have never seen a specific culture of astrology that we could call Portuguese, because we don't have many published books from that period on astrology, unless the almanac. There's the almanacs, but they're not really purely astrological books. They're more to the grand public. What's your perception of the practice in Spain?
That's a very interesting question, and I've always wanted to find out if something like that exists in any country, some specificity of astrological practice. I always think that one of the many things I learned reading Keith Thomas' Religion and the Decline of Magic, with all the criticisms that nowadays we can make to it, but we all learned a lot from it. It was a great work. And one of the things he suggested at a certain point was making some kind of comparative work of practice of astrology, or ideas on astrology more, was what he was proposing in different countries in Europe. And I've always thought that that's a great project that we should do. Of course, we should do it nowadays with the new perspectives, with the new methodologies of history of science, with everything we've learned from in the last 50 years, because there's the anniversary, you've seen it, of the book, and comparing the ideas and practices of different countries, would we find something specific from a country? Because it seems to me that the ideas, the theory, is pretty common, is shared, not just comparing countries, but comparing social classes. As you said, scholars were teaching the same astrology as popular practitioners were publishing in almanacs and prognostications. So it was the same corpus of knowledge. The only thing I can think of is that each astrologer predicts regional specificities of politics, and but that's not surprising. I mean, it doesn't say anything about.
Yeah.
Only thing I seriously I would say is that the encounter with the Americas, with the New World, had a bigger impact that we have acknowledged yet. That astrology was one of the disciplines. I published a paper on this. Was one of the disciplines that was so impacted by the discovery, by the encounter with the New World, that it had to change, because it had a choreographical attribution of astrological properties for its country and for its ethnicity and people known. And suddenly there's a new territory with no astrological association. So I think that's one of the specific things in which astrology changed, or was in a certain way specific in Spain and Portugal, probably the same.
Yeah, I would also suspect that. Although I'm surprised that we have the travel, so the navigation start very early, and I haven't found, at least I haven't found it yet, any discussions on that early on, because that would be something that would immediately come up, because as they would navigate and they're starting to try to practice astrology in those sudden latitudes, they would start to have problems. When they're starting to find new territory, they will have problems. But you really don't see a discussion, a very active discussion on that. It exists, but much later, I think.
That's interesting. It's late, maybe. It's maybe when colonization, or when they started.
I've seen.
Sorry.
I've seen in my research of my recent PhD with the Jesuits. You see them, especially in Brazil, which is kind of a blank spot, which we don't have much information on astrological practice at that period. You see one of the Jesuits sort of hinting that so long has passed since these lands were colonized, and we still don't have astrological rules set for them. He doesn't go into very detail. It's not detailed, unfortunately, but you see that it's there. They're thinking of it. Why don't we have it?
But there are some, of course, a bit late, as you say, but in New Spain, in Mexico, some of the best known publications and the most studied publications, which are the Repertory by Enrico Martinez and Diego Cisneros' Sitio, Naturaleza y Propiedades de la Ciudad de México. These works have been studied by historians for a long time. I mean, we have known the contents of these works for a long time, but the astrological references in them have been diminished somehow in previous historiography. And they specifically say, we have no information about the astrological properties of Mexico, the city of Mexico, and I want to create them. And they both go into that. They disagree, of course, as we know. But it's there. They are trying to do that, to create a new astrology for the city of Mexico.
And it would be logical to assume that is happening with other authors or other practitioners, even if they don't publish. That must be something that they're concerned about. There's a problem. They go into that because they would need it. As you said, the choreographic establishments, which signs, rules, which region, which city, how they work with that. Medicine needed that to do their work, and prediction, any kind of weather prediction or world events prediction would need that information. So it's I think it's a topic that it's still in need of a more thorough research.
It is, and in South American territories, I mean, they not only have a new territory with the same stars, they have a new territory with new stars.
Exactly.
So you have to create a completely different astrology, or what? What did they do?
Yeah. I've been studying that a little bit for the project that I'm involved now, and you do come up with that problem of the inversion of the seasons. And you have the Ptolemaic, because Ptolemaic astrology, which is the mainstream astrology at that point, is based on the seasonal properties to explain why the signs work in a certain way. Right. And so if you invert that, what do you do?
Exactly.
and that
that's
discussion
great. That's a very interesting thing.
And they're debating a lot of that. I went into that a little bit in my own PhD. But it needs further investigation, which is what do they do? Because then you have people saying, oh, yes, we do. The logic is we invert the whole system of astrology to accommodate the new seasons and the new structure. And then you have people like some of those authors you mentioned and others saying, well, that's not exactly what we are experiencing here in practice. So perhaps this is not. It doesn't work like that. And unfortunately, it's a discussion that hasn't been handled a lot, but it's a very interesting one to research.
That's right. Yeah, I'm very interested in that, because I also have been focusing on the fact that early modern astrologers were not, as modern people would think, doing things arbitrarily, just attributing properties or health issues, etc., the way they wanted, with some astronomical information. They had an established system, a theory, the Ptolemaic system, and then the Arab editions, etc., of the medieval period. And they had rules. They couldn't say, let's just invert it. And of course, it didn't make sense. They had a system to adhere to. Yeah. So it had to be a great problem for them.
Yeah. They couldn't make it up as they go.
No, they couldn't. That's the thing we have to. I think that's something that the general audience says. Of course, we're discussing these things with the other historians of astrology to know what we're talking about. But if we want our research to get to general audiences, we have to transmit this idea that this was not what we know as astrology nowadays, or what you're thinking about. Yeah. We're talking about an established system with scientific rules, or rational rules, established guides, that you couldn't just say, now this sign is hot and dry, when the tradition said the opposite.
Exactly.
That couldn't be done.
Yeah, that's a very important point. And sometimes it's those little words that you have to say every time you talk about the history of astrology. You have to explain, we're not talking about the same system that we know today. We're talking about something which is not so arbitrarily. It is ingrained and really there in the philosophical cosmology. It's there. You cannot say something just out of your mind. It has to follow the rules, even when they're interpreting things. And this is something that sometimes, I think you probably found this a lot. Sometimes historians say, oh, they said this because they wanted to please the king. Well, yeah, of course they're going to say things so that they have a better reception from their audience. That's obvious, but they need to follow the rules. They cannot say something that it's not there clearly. And the people that they're talking to know enough astrology to sort of figure it out that it's something not wrong.
That's what I was going to say as well. I was just reading a couple of days ago a source, a natal figure sent to the court for the king, for Philip III, and it was clear that he knew that other people who knew about astrology was going to read his text and was going to judge it. So he had to justify every time if he was taking this from Ptolemy, from Albumasar or something, because he couldn't just make up whatever he wanted to say to the king. Everything's gonna be okay.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and that's something that really needs to be explained. Going back a bit to what we're talking about, so the specificity, if there is one, of Iberian astrology, we could talk about that. Have you found any significant references to the practice of the medieval period? Because we have a strong practice of astrology with Alfonso the 10th. You see there's a thriving practice of astrology with the Arabs in the Jewish community, which then goes to the Christian community as well. Have you seen any echoes of that in the discourse of astrologers by the 16th and 17th century?
Good question. Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, they are working as if they are inside the same system as medieval astrologers. At least that's my perception. I know things are different in the 16th century, and then they are different in the 17th century as well, in different periods. But and also, even when Renaissance astrologers started to say that they wanted to go back to a purely Ptolemaic astrology, they were using medieval works and medieval authors, and even when Arab authors or Jewish authors were included in the inquisitorial indexes, etc., they were being used exactly the same as they had been before. I think they were inside the same corpus of knowledge, the same system, and I think we need to know. I mean, early modern astrologers, or those of us who study early modern astrologers, we need to get to know very well medieval activity. So we need medievalists. I always say I love medievalists. They have always studied the things we need to know. Before we have.
Yeah, and sometimes not enough, because we do need to know a little bit more about the authors. There's a point where, when we're studying, and we've both been studying 16th, 17th century, we have a lot of published material, printed material. So their main source, I think, we can assume that it's printed material. But before that, if you go back to the early 16th century and even the 15th century, and Elena was more the expert in this time that I am, but there's still a lot of manuscript tradition, and not all of the manuscript tradition comes into print. So I think in terms, and this a little bit related to the Astro project, in terms of techniques and the line of transmission, we're still missing a little bit of the 16th century. Which authors are more important, because we can see what they're quoting in 17th century works, but what are the 16th century writers basing themselves on? Because there are some new things coming in, technically speaking, on astrology in the 16th century that weren't in the medieval period, that it would be, and this is one of my sort of pet projects on the side, is to understand, where does that come from? It is something that's created at that time, proposed by someone, or is it a more mute tradition that's in there, but we aren't seeing it in the main front. So that's something I always think. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And what are you researching now? What has been your focus of research at this point?
So the project, the European Research Council funded project directed by Pietro Modeo, where I'm working, is titled Early Modern Cosmology. focuses on cosmological ideas and the way institutional and religious context affected the intellectual milieu, the ideas. So my specific project within this is to study the way this institutional and religious context affected practitioners of astrology in the Spanish world. So this means I'm focusing on institutions, on the universities, on the Casa de Contratación and the Academy of Mathematics, which were other institutions of knowledge in the Spain of the period, as in Portugal, and in the Jesuit College, as the main institutions that had a specific institutional culture and a specific scientific culture and the religious element that would affect how astrologers addressed their astrology, how it made part of cosmology and discussed it. Because many members of the group, of the Early Modern Cosmology group, were focusing on Protestant countries, like Pietro works on Germany and others. And so the thing is, if we're trying to discuss how the religious setting affected the ideas, we need to focus both in Protestant contexts and Catholic countries. So I'm continuing to work my work on Spain in this framework, and we'll see. I mean, the institutions are very complicated, as you know.
Yeah, they are, and there's always. Well, I think I agree with you. I think that's a very important avenue of research, because I've noticed as well in my period, and I studied the Jesuits, so we're talking about an institution in themselves, and you see how practices of that period are extremely shaped, especially in the Catholic countries, by the Church and the Inquisition. You know, they really shaped their.
That's exactly. That's the other part of the project. I'm focusing on the institutions of knowledge, and I'm always working, I think, since the beginning of my career, on the Inquisition and its attitude towards astrology. It's the measures the Spanish Inquisition specifically took against astrology, or not so much against, because this has also been a bit distorted. The idea that the persecution was so harsh, and it was not. I mean, we only have to see the 3,000 astrological prognostications that we have left, and only a small percentage of them, and we have 32 actually forbidden. So the idea that it was a systematic
persecution. They were not, at least that I know of, burning astrologers.
No,
they were taking into courts sometimes, but
exactly. I'm studying the trials, because which are not that many. I'm as I say, I've been working on that for several years, and I'm always finding some new trial with some reference to astrology, but there are not many. And certainly the sentences, the end result was not hard. I mean, they were just, it's not like what happened with Jewish.
I think I agree with you. They're more focused, at least from what I've seen from the cases here in Portugal, they're more focused on the Jews and the Jewish practices than astrology. What they never like is when you get into the divinatory magical practices, then they can be a little harsh, but even so, sometimes. But
I mean, of course, if they send you to the galleys for 5 years, it's harsh. but you're not going to be burnt or killed.
Yeah, exactly.
And
Yeah.
well, yeah, I usually read trials to astrologers or physicians who were practicing astrology, and that's fine. But once while I was at the National Archive in Madrid, I I read one of the files of a person accused of being a Jewish practitioner and teaching Judaism, etc. And that was terrible. I couldn't bear it. I mean, those trials, those are the terrifying ones.
Yeah.
The ones with torture and luckily for us, at least that's the way I see it. The trials we need to study don't have those elements.
Yeah. The closest I've got to that, I never really read one of the harsh ones. I know they exist. I've read a little bit of the trial of André Duavelar, who was a mathematician, very famous mathematician, and then he was accused of Jewish practices because apparently he had a Jewish origin. And what's terrifying in his testimony is how they insist continuously in the same topic. They ask the questions along the whole time. You see the witnesses changing because they're going to be pressured continuously. And what has been most touching is that you see his signature at the end of each of the trials, and you can see it degrading as time goes. You get a very clear signature in the first one, then the latest one, it's all wobbly as
he's weak and
he's weakened and he's tired and he's
that's terrible.
And that's, you can see it, physical evidence of his pressure that he was into, and that's very touching.
But it's interesting. One of those kinds of trials are very interesting because some of them have in past historiographies been put as examples of the persecution of astrology by the Inquisition. And the actual reason, if you read the trial, I mean, they didn't care much about astrology. How many questions did they ask him about astrology? They only cared about his Jewish practices.
Yeah, as far as I've seen, none.
Okay.
I was going to exactly searching for that. Is it really being trial astrology? As some historians say, not that I've never seen anything. It's always Jewish practices, crypto Judaism, Jewish practices, new Christians. That's what they're going for. Not his mathematics, not his astrology, and he's a published author.
He is, and he's known. That's the same I have found in Spanish trials.
So I would expect to be something common because although we had different systems of Inquisition in Portugal and Spain at that time, they were separate, but they're more or less under the same umbrella.
I guess so. Maybe it's a bit more different with Italian Inquisition or with the Roman one. But I have only read the historiography on that. I mean, the rules seem to be the same, but then the attitudes and the trials are not the same, I would say. We have to research more about that as well.
Because that will give us a lot of information on how it's seen publicly and the impact. What the research I've done in the Inquisition, and I've published that in my latest paper on that few years ago, it seems that they are sort of lenient to a lot of practices, but where they are very sensitive is when it comes to the almanacs or the books, the repertorios, so the books that have more a wider audience. Then they become very strict in the index, and they start nitpicking, on small things. You cannot say this because this might be misunderstood.
That's right. You're right about that. That's true.
And so I've never seen them going after, university teachers because they're teaching astrology. I don't think that's a problem for them.
No, I think the same, and that's exactly what I have found in the past years of a fascinating trial of a person. He was a lawyer, and he went himself to the Inquisition to denounce himself. They did that sometimes, and he brought his student notes of the University of Valencia, where he had studied astrology a few years before the trial, and he spoke about the professor and what he taught and the astrological contents. Not all of them approved by the Inquisition, and he explained everything, and he left the Inquisition his notes of what he had learned in class, which is it's a great source that I want to publish soon.
Oh, I'll be waiting for that. Yeah, seriously, that's a treasure.
Yeah, it is. I was so happy when I found it. Yeah. And this professor, who was known and who was still teaching at the university the same contents, the Inquisition didn't care about him. Never went after him or after other professors teaching the same contents. They didn't care, actually.
Yeah, I don't think that was a problem. And as you said in some of your papers, sometimes the trials, the few ones I've seen, and I think you've said this, is they're quite lenient sometimes with things that we were expecting them to be more harsh, and then they just let it pass, and you think, why?
Yeah, sometimes the trials just stop, like suspended. And sometimes it's just they tell the defendant, don't do this again.
Yeah.
And that's it.
That's it, yeah. And sometimes very basic things that we would expect, they're going to go for that, they simply ignore.
Right.
So, yeah. And we also have to consider that most of these inquisitors were knowledgeable of the astrological practice, at least in the very basic level. They would know what they're talking about, As we were talking earlier, it's part of their culture, so that they more or less have an aware of.
That's right. I've always been thinking, if astrology was part of the studies in the Faculty of Arts in most of Europe, in many universities, everyone who went to the university had at least attended a course on astrology. So they knew at least the general.
That's what I've seen, at least in the authors I studied recently, in the Jesuit authors, you see that. Even when they're against astrology or against practice of divination, etc., or they don't think it's very scientific, they know what they're talking about.
That's
true. They know the subject. They learned it at some point. And I even seen evidence of it being taught to princes, so to in the court. By the tutors of the court, they're teaching their students some basis of what is, because they need to know. It's part of their culture. It's something that's practiced continuously, so they need to be knowledgeable of that. It's. But still, with so much information we have, we still don't have a complete picture, which is.
We don't. We have to there's much more we need to know. We need to find out. Some. Many things about the Inquisitions in their diverse settings and what they did with astrologers or in trials. And then there's the issue of censorship, which has been more studied, and there's more historiography about it. But I still think the studies have focused on the indexes very much, but we need to go deeper and try to find the reports of the experts consulted, which is also one of the things I'm trying to do in a long durée of my research, because the reports sent to the Inquisition, they are fascinating. There's some theologians defending astrology and explaining to the other theologians and to the inquisitors, you don't know enough about astrology to decide about it. But I am a theologian and also an astrologer, and I can tell you what's licit and what's not. And the perspectives are very different from what we would think just reading the index. So there's much to do there.
Yeah, I think and this is something I argue a lot. It's that this manuscript tradition, because this is going to be on manuscripts.
Right.
It's much more rich than what we see in print. You know, we usually go to. It's much easier, of course, to go to the printed sources and study them.
Right.
But we need the manuscript tradition. We need one of your topics of interest, the discussions that they're having amongst themselves. This is something that, for example, we don't have with astrology, a good study on that. Letters that are being exchanged. What are they talking about amongst themselves?
That would be a dream, to find letters.
Oh, yes.
I'm so envious of historians of British astrology. They have all those letters and books and the case books that Lauren Castle has been studying, with all that notes of the astrologers and their practice.
Yeah, they have so much material to study still. That's amazing, and we have very
at least not that we have found. So I hope someday to find letters between two astrologers discussing something.
Yeah,
but
yeah, it would be a rare finding, I think, unfortunately.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, let's hope that changes.
At least it seems that we're going to be able to find more sources like this one we were discussing a minute ago, student notes of what was really being taught. Because you have worked with those in Santantal, with manuscript notes, lecture notes, and student notes. And those are sources that I think we can find for many universities in Europe, and that would give us much more knowledge about what they were really studying and what they considered scientific and acceptable for an academic setting.
That's I think that's a huge question that has never been really answered. Is how is astrology learned?
Exactly.
How are they learning it? You know, what are the programs? Are they different from university to university? How does that work?
There's that article by Darren Hayton explaining the teaching at the University of, was that Vienna or I don't think. I think it's one of the universities in Austria. And he's explaining that the manuscript lecture notes suggest that astrology was taught in a very practical way, using instruments and with practice in mind. And that's something that, for instance, the sources I have, not many for now, for the University of Valencia or Salamanca, it's not the same. They are more focused on general theory and on teaching how to make a figure and so on. So I think those sources are something we should explore.
Exactly. In that regard, for example, the Jesuits' notes that I've studied focus a lot on practice. So they have a strong mathematical background that is embedded into astrology. So they're very concerned if the student knows how to calculate these events. Let me give you an example. For example, eclipses. You know, the study of eclipses and lunations for weather and world events. They spend a long time explaining eclipses, parallax, how to calculate them. So there's a very strong mathematical introduction, and then they get to the interpretation part. So they're very concerned that the students know how to operate the mathematics and the instruments.
That's very interesting. The sources I have seen were more focused on giving the students cosmological framework to understand how astrology fits. So it's more a natural philosophical explanation at the beginning, and then the astrological contents.
Yeah, that might perhaps, well, just out thinking out of my head, probably has to do with the background of the teacher or the university.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, with these examples I was referring, these people are mathematicians, so that's their main focus.
Right.
Or, for example, the teacher you're mentioning, which has those kind of notes, probably comes from a more natural philosophy background, so is not going to focus so much
on the same
mathematics.
thing. That's true.
Perhaps, that's something something fun to explore in the future.
Indeed, some more work to do.
Yeah. Yeah. So, are you publishing anything, or have you published anything recently that would you like to mention that?
So my most recent publication, which was before all this pandemic craziness started, was in a collective work published by the Max by the Max Planck by Matteo Valeriani, which is a researcher there who has a huge project, a wonderful project on the sphere of Sacrobosco, which was the textbook for studying astronomy, basic knowledge for all students. And he has done lots of things, studying the different versions of it and how it was used and taught in different places in Europe. So he edited this collective volume on the authors of commentaries to the sphere, and I contributed with a paper on one of the most relevant scholars in the beginning of the 16th century in Spain. I would say late 15th century, beginning of the 16th century, which was Pedro Sánchez Ciruelo, who was a theologian at the universities of Alcalá and Salamanca, and who studied in Paris in the last decade of the 15th century, which is also a very interesting context for astrological ideas in Paris. Your last guest has explained in his work, Jean-Baptiste Boudet, has taught us so much about astrology in late 15th century in Paris. And this is where Ciruelo studied, and then he came back to Spain and wanted to focus on his theological works, but he published this huge work on astrology, defending how to be an astrologer, but a good Christian at the same time. And so this paper I published in, and he wrote a commentary on Sacrobosco sphere with astrological elements using Pierre Deilly. We were talking about medieval authors used. And he introduced the astrological context through Pierre Deilly in his works. So that's the last. And I think it was an interesting study. And in the volume where other authors are using the sphere in different ways, it's a good volume that Valeriani edited.
I have to take a look at that. Pedro Ciruelo is one of the authors that I've seen oftenly cited by the Jesuits, and also other authors of this time. They cite him a lot. So I think it was, at least in an Iberian context, and perhaps a little bit outside it as well, he was a very important author because they keep referring to him or comparing what he says with other opinions. So
that's right. I think he's a very relevant author, and there's much more to do about him as well.
Exactly. We really study what he's published and what are his point of views.
And also now I'm with my book project, which I don't know when it will be finished, but let's hope during this academic year, which will be a general overview of astrology in early modern Spain in the different spheres where it was involved in medical practice, at the court, at the universities. I will leave the parts on the Inquisition outside of this book, or just mention them, because I want to do a future book specifically on astrology and the Spanish Inquisition. But for now, I want to do the court, the institutions, medicine, popular publications, that sort of overview of the presence of astrology in 16th and 17th century Spain.
Well, I've been looking forward for it.
Thank you very much.
That would be an important contribution, because I think we do need these more general overviews, of practices, because we need that reference to really, as we were saying earlier, and you were saying earlier, to do a comparison, or to really understand what's happening. Because I think the research so far has been, at least in visible terms, has been much centered in England, because they have a lot of material, fortunately. And we need to expand that a little bit more.
Yeah. That's the idea. Yeah. And then from there, we go in depth into the different subjects.
Exactly.
That's my plan.
Yeah, I think it's a very good plan.
Thanks.
Yeah, well, Tayra, thank you very much for accepting this invitation. It was lovely to talk to you. Finally, we have been trying to to speak directly for a long time. It was very nice, and thank you for your overview of your work. Yeah.
Thank you. It has been great to be here and contribute to your podcast, and talking to other specialists in the field is always something that helps us.
Yeah.
For our own research, I know that. So this is something very much needed. So thank you.
No, thank you.